Thank you. Oh, very loud. My name is Jenna Matthews. I am presenting a paper that I wrote with my team here, Dr. Hillary Swanson, Morgan Slugantz, and Kasha Miller, talking about our work putting up here inside the loop for learning analytics and the outcomes that we've seen for that so far. First, I'll start with the setting of this project. We are working with a small community college in Kentucky in the southeastern United States, focusing on a general education math course. This is one that is set up for non-STEM major students and functions as a gatekeeper course. So this is a course that students so again, this is a community college general education math course. It's required for graduation for non-STEM majors, students who are not interested in math or science careers, and as such, it serves as a sort of gatekeeper and unfortunately is a barrier to graduation for many of these students because of a historically low course completion rate. Before we did this project, there were several other attempts to fix the course through redesign or transferring the format for delivery, and none of those had been successful. So when I joined the team, the first step was to get back to the data that we had available. So the data we had was keystroke activity as students were working inside an online platform, mostly in a homework or practice setting, but also things like quizzes and some of their exams. So in these student actions, we had things like a guided solution where students could request the platform or the system to walk them through the steps of solving a problem and then get their input at specific points. They could also request a worked example, which was very similar except that it didn't require any student input at all. It would just step through the process of solving the problem. And finally, they could request a hint that would just point out an area of the problem or a step that they might be missing in order to continue. These data also included flags such as whether the student had answered correctly and whether that correct answer was on their first try or their first time interacting with the problem. And using these data, we put together a metric called giving up. The first step was to take all of the student activity and group it into sessions. We used the same process that Google Analytics uses, which is a 30-minute lag time between actions. So as long as the next action happened within those 30 minutes, it was part of the same session. We did this because we found a lot of students who would have multiple sessions on the same day, so grouping everything by the calendar date was problematic. Students whose session for a single session would cross the midnight barrier, so they're working very late, but again, using the calendar date is problematic for that as well. And inside that session, we looked for problems that the student was working on, meaning that they interacted with it, they checked their answer, or sought out a hint or a guided solution of some sort. And within that set of problems that they worked on, we looked for those that they hadn't solved before they ended the session. So we ended up with a session level giving up percentage. Is it having issues? Okay. We ended up with a session level giving up percentage where we would take the problems that students gave up on as the numerator and the total problems that they had worked on or interacted with as the denominator. And that individual session percentage didn't end up being meaningful at all. As you can probably understand, as educators, as analysts, and as former students or current students yourself, having a bad day is no indicator of success or failure in the course. And Similarly, having a really bad session where you work on things but give up on all of them is not an indicator of your ultimate success either. But what we did find was if we looked across several sessions to see how students were trending, that became meaningful in terms of giving us sort of an early warning that students were going to withdraw from the course or fail an exam. And as we were interpreting this, we saw it as some small-scale giving up, where they're giving up on problems, and if they keep doing that more and more, it turns into a larger scale giving up behavior where they're giving up on the course overall. And in those instances, we had as much as 30 days between when we saw this trend appear and when students ultimately withdrew from the course. And for early indicators for student success teams, that is an incredible amount of time for advisors and faculty to reach out to students and see if there's anything that can be done in order to redirect that pathway. And at this point, we looked at prior research for peer mentors or near peer mentors and decided that we wanted to pull in a peer in this part of the process. So we looked for a student at the same institution who was a little bit ahead, so like a year 2 student who could reach out to year 1 students. And we gave this peer a list of students with a code for the outreach reason. The highest priority was a trend of this giving up metric, but we also looked for things like exam scores or just a total lack of activity, showing that students had disengaged with the course overall. And this outreach, the peer would then create open-ended messages in a peer voice that would reach out to the student, introduce them, and this is an example message that the peer guide would send saying, "I'm a student as well as a peer guide. I would love to hear from you and see how your math course is going. Can you tell me how you think you're doing?" It was very important to us for this project that the initial outreach didn't focus on the math concepts that were going on in the course right then. We were aware of previous work that's also cited in our paper that showed that sometimes difficulties in courses, especially emotional or affective difficulty, were not based on the course content or an understanding gap, but on everything else that was going on in the student's life at the time. And because of that, the peer guide would have a variety of resources that they could provide to the students. Some of them were academic. The peer guide could connect students to a tutor who was focused on the course and familiar with the content. And if the problem that the student is having is a lack of understanding or difficulty, then that would be the path that the peer guide would use. But we also had a variety of non-cognitive resources that the peer guide would keep track of and point students towards. These included financial aid, the food pantry that the campus maintained, and counseling services, as well as others. One of the things that we found for students who did respond to the peer guide was that in many of the cases, the cause of their problems was something outside of the course. They had lost their job, they were having difficulty buying groceries, somebody in the family was sick, all these other things that were going on that were showing up in this affective behavior of just having less persistence and being more likely to give up. And our peer guide was able to connect these students to resources that matched those needs instead of just blindly pointing them to a tutor because they had not passed their last homework assignment. And as a result, we saw 2 different categories of outcomes that I want to share with you. The first one is in student behavior. We looked at this same metric up until the moment of outreach and then after the outreach. And an important thing to keep in mind for this is that these changes in student behavior were not impacted by whether the student responded to the outreach. So just receiving a text message or a phone call, even if it was left as a voicemail. Just that awareness and reminder that somebody at the school was there and noticed them seemed to have an impact on their behavior. We looked especially at 3 groups of students because this school, like many others in the United States, was focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So there were subgroups of students that they were especially focused on tracking in terms of both behavior and course performance. The first of these is first-generation students. These are students that in other studies have been shown to have some difficulty with the emotional aspect of adjusting to life in a higher ed institution, partially because they're the first ones in their family to be there, and so it feels unusual. They might feel out of place. We did see a 6% improvement in behavior. That's 6% more of the problems that they would persist with and end up solving. But for the first generation students, it wasn't statistically significant, as you can see by this p-value over here of 0.13. We did, however, see a strong statistical significant difference for our African American students at the institution. Their behavior improved by 7.83% in the session immediately after receiving outreach. And as you can see here, this was strongly significant. The other group that we saw a strong significant change with was the Pell eligible students. Pell eligibility is used in the US as sort of a broad measure of financial need. So these are students who might be unable to attend school if it weren't for grants and scholarships. And we saw a very good, and again, significant difference for them in terms of their immediate behavior. The other outcome focus that we looked at was in terms of overall course success. The semester that we were working with here was fall of 2021, and at that time, many of the courses on campus were still dealing with issues from the COVID shutdown 18 months before, and still trying to find any way to bring their course back to success rates. This particular course was one of the first ones at the institution to surpass their pre-COVID rate of passing. You can see that the COVID semester involved an 8% drop, and the semester that we were doing this intervention and had no other changes in the course was just over 8.5% of an increase in course success. So it got the course back above the COVID levels. But what we saw during this first semester of having a peer involved in the analytics and especially the outreach process was a change in the behavior we were tracking, especially for those groups of students that were under high attention or high scrutiny from the institution leadership. We also saw a change in the course success, making this one of the first courses at the institution to return to pre-COVID success levels. And because of that, we were able to move on to our current in-progress steps, which involved expanding this work to 7 additional campuses inside the Kentucky system and looking at the college algebra course, which as a subject has long been a focus of learning analytics and other research because of the difficulty and the gatekeeper status it has. We are seeing the student behavior impact continue as we move on with this project, and looking forward to doing an analysis of the course success rates. And I'd like to thank you all for listening. This has a link to download the paper, and this is my contact for any questions after the meeting, but we'll see before.